Hello and welcome to another edition of Books and Things. My name is Kenny and I am the senior pastor of Hickory Grove Presbyterian Church in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. Today I want to talk to you about Cornelis Van Dam's The Deacon, Biblical Foundations for Today's Ministry of Mercy. This book was recommended to me by a number of friends for deacon training. I have a group of deacons as well as deacon candidates that I'm taking through training right now, and I found this to be a wonderful resource for them that I'm actually going to adapt into a teaching series in Sunday school for the entire church. I thought it was that good. But if you're looking for a book on the diaconate, or if you're looking for a book on mercy ministry in general, poverty alleviation, what that looks like in the church, done both by deacons as an official position and by the whole of the church, this book is a really great introduction primer. It'll walk you through what that looks like biblically, historically, and practically. The book is broken out into four sections or four parts really. The first part is the Old Testament backgrounds. He dives into an analysis of poverty in ancient Israel, the different types of poverty, the different types of impoverished peoples. He has an exposition of the eighth commandment, and he also has an excellent discussion on the roles of the individual, the role of the family, on the role of the state, and how and what it looks like biblically for poverty to be addressed at each one of those levels, and who's kind of most immediately responsible for dealing with the mercy ministry needs that crop up in the community of God's people. In the second part, it turns from the Old Testament to the New Testament. The New Testament's teaching on the diaconate in general, and again, the ministry of mercy within the church. So there's a chapter on Christ's ministry of mercy, Christ's teaching, his words and his deeds. There's also a chapter on the general ministry of the church, looking specifically at Acts 6 and the development and evolution of the actual office of the diaconate and what the New Testament teaches specifically on the office of deacon. In the third part, it looks at the office of deacon as it developed through history. We see in the earliest church, in the New Testament and earliest church history, that the deacon is an office in its own right. The deacons have a job to do, which focuses specifically on mercy ministry in and around the church. But as the history develops, the office of deacon evolves somewhat from an office of ministry and mercy, service and help, into something more like a junior elder. All of the mercy ministry, all of the almsgiving, all these sorts of things get concentrated within the office of the bishop. And then the bishop starts to deploy deacons as junior elders, assistants. Their tasks become more liturgically focused and less focused on ministering to the saints. In the Reformation, that's one of the things that gets retrieved in terms of ecclesiastical reformation. The office of deacon is restored to its biblical purview of not assisting the elders, but leading the church, exercising a kind of authority and seeing to the practical, physical, financial, those sorts of needs that crop up in the community. After looking at the office in history, in the fourth part, it gets more practical when Van Dam looks at the function of the diaconate today, the relationship between the office of deacon and the office of elder, and how deacons are supposed to function alongside elders in the church. He talks about resourcing deacons. He talks about enabling deacons. He talks about how deacons can lead the church in learning how to be generous and how to be liberal with their giving. He talks about the ministry of the church within the congregation and how the deacons ought to oversee and lead in that. Also talks about mercy ministry outside the congregation and asks good and important questions about what is the church's responsibility to the communion or the community around us, and what is the deacon's responsibility in leading the church in that sort of mercy ministry. I know that was helpful to us as we continue to wrestle with what it looks like for us to serve well both within our congregation and without in the broader community. Just to wrap this up, two really key takeaways that I thought were super helpful in this book, and I would warmly commend the book as a whole, but especially its discussion on this. First has to do with the role of institutions, the role of families, the role of the church itself, the role even of the state. There are a lot of really interesting and important questions to be wrestled with when you're thinking about diaconal ministry. Someone in the church is struggling. Who ought to be the first line of defense for that person? Who ought to be the first person to serve them? You know, one of the worst things a diaconate could do, say, if me as a husband and father, I was failing to care for my family, they might step in and kind of brush me aside and say, all right, you're not going to feed your kids. We'll feed your kids for you. Well, in a limited sense, yes, if my kids are starving and I won't feed them, the diaconate ought to step in and do something about that. But if they haven't done something about me in order to minister to me, to bring the elders alongside and deal with me and equip me and resource me to get back to doing what I ought to do as a husband and father, then they've actually failed in their diaconal ministry. They have not served me or my family well. They have enabled me in my dysfunction and provided a kind of safety net for my family as I went astray. So there's a lot of respect for those sorts of institutional structures and observing them and honoring them and seeking to restore them in this book that I think is really helpful for deacons in particular, but all Christians to observe as we think about how we do mercy ministry so that we can actually help people without hurting them. Second key takeaway that I thought was very helpful, and it's kind of an overarching takeaway because this comes up early on in the Old Testament backgrounds of mercy ministry and also in Jesus' teaching. And it's this idea that poverty alleviation is very closely linked to liberation. And I know that liberation can be a scary word theologically when we start thinking about liberation theology. Van Dam doesn't get into any of that. The basic idea is this. What is the main motivator for poverty alleviation in Israel, or what is it supposed to be? Or at least one of the main motivators. What lies at the center? It is the fact that God set his people free from slavery in Egypt. And it would be a horrible, horrible tragedy if, after having been set free from slavery, they find themselves in a whole new form of bondage in the form of material lack, in the form of poverty. And the same thing applies to us in the church today. Christ has set us free from Satan's sin and death, and he has gathered us together as a church body in order to worship him in spirit, in truth, in freedom. And how tragic would it be if we had people in our midst who were suffering for whatever reason? You know, they don't have enough money, so they don't have access to health care. They're sick all the time because they can't afford to go to the doctor. Okay. While we're sitting there and worshiping in spirit and truth, they're trying just to stay awake, or they're trying just to keep it together. Or maybe some of us in the church, our bellies are full, we're warm, we're comfortable, and yet we're sitting down the pew from someone who hasn't had a meal in days. Do you think that's going to affect their ability to worship? It absolutely is going to affect their ability to worship. So it's casting mercy ministry in this frame where we understand that ministering to our brothers and sisters, alleviating their needs, alleviating their impoverished conditions, is actually setting them free in a way to come worship alongside us in spirit and truth. There's so much more that I could say about that. Again, I would warmly commend the book to you, but it is a beautiful motivator to consider that as we minister to the needs of our brothers and sisters in Christ, all of us, with our every member diaconate, and especially with those who've been called and equipped to serve and lead in that sort of ministry, as we do that, we are extending the freedom that we have received in Christ. And that is a very good and beautiful thing. All right, thank you for joining me today as we considered this book, The Deacon by Cornelis Van Dam. Again, I warmly commend it to you, and I will look forward to being with you again soon. Bye-bye.